All right, lesson 8 is on roots, specifically square roots and cubed roots. So we're going to address both of those. So I think square roots you're probably pretty familiar with by now. So a square root has a symbol that looks like this. That is actually called a radical sign. So that's something for your notebook and probably your vocab that you've already done. So a radical sign. And if it does not have a number up here, it's assumed to be a 2. Just like with an exponent, a variable, whenever it doesn't have an exponent, you assume it's a 1. So anytime you see a radical sign with no number here, you assume that is a 2. All right? So square root just basically means what number times itself gives you that number. What number times itself? So 4, 2 times 2. The square root of 64, 8 times 8. So square root of 4, 2 is your answer. Square root of 64, 8 is your answer. Square root of 100, 10, because 10 times 10 is 100. So that's the basics of that. And now let's go and do some examples here. If I have the square root of 64, what number times itself? 8. We've already discussed that one over here. Now, here's something new. Plus or minus. If it has a plus or minus, this is what it means. Of course, if you have the square root of something, it's the number times itself, right? So what I want you to think of, what if this were a -2 and a -2? Would that still give me 4? Yes. So whenever they have the plus and minus there, they're wanting you to consider both roots. All right? So plus or minus means I could have had a 1.1 times 1.1 to get this, or I could have also had a negative times a negative to get this. So anytime it has that plus or minus, that's what they are talking about. All right, let's look at this one. This one, anytime you have the square root of a fraction, basically what I want you to think of it is, this is the square root of 25 over the square root of 36. You just need to take the square roots of both numbers. Now, it does have this negative sign out front, so make sure that that negative sign is on your answer. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 36 is 6. So -5/6. Number 4, square root of a negative. That's an interesting dilemma you got there. So if it's a square root of a negative, that means a number times itself has to equal a negative, which is not mathematically possible. I know that 16 is going to be 4 times 4. But that's a positive 16. What if I put negatives on both of them? What's a negative times a negative? A positive. So there's not actually an answer for this. So what would you write? Well, you wouldn't just leave it blank, although I know that'd be pretty tempting. You would actually write out the words, no solution. Now, don't get the fancy idea that anytime you don't know one, or, oh, I don't really feel like doing that one, or, I just don't get it. I'm just going to put a no solution. Has to only be ones that make no mathematical sense. Well, some of you may be saying none of these make any mathematical sense. So just try them. And if you have questions, make sure you ask. All right. I want you to pause it and try these next 4 examples right here. All right, back with me. A, square root of 9 over the square root of 16 should give you 3/4. Plus or minus, so make sure you put plus or minus in the answer. 0.81, the square root of 0.81 means that you may actually have to try some decimals out here. So I know that 81 is going to be 9, so I know there's going to be a 9 in it. But this isn't just 81, it's 0.81. So maybe try putting a decimal, maybe 0.9 times 0.9. And there you go. So it's plus or minus 0.9. The opposite of, or minus, the square root of 49, square root of 49 is 7. So the answer is the opposite of 7, or -7. Now, D, again, remember you cannot have a square root that is negative. So what would you put here? Not IDK, or I don't get it, or I love math, but I just don't understand. No solution. No solution. All right, let's move on down here to example 5. Let's get rid of this. Example 5. It says solve t squared equals 169 and check your solutions. So again, I want you to think of anytime it has an example like this where it has a variable, what are all the possible solutions for t? All the possible solutions for t. So in other words, what numbers can I put in here squared, which would give you 169? Well, that happens to be 13. All right, so 13 squared 169. 13 squared, 169. But again, there's something else I could also put in here. So not only 13 squared, but I could also put in negative 13 squared, which is 169. So you can tell me your answer is plus or minus 13, which covers both. Or if you prefer to write it out this way, you can do that. I would accept either. So pause it and try E, F, and G. All right, so anytime you have a letter, if you're back with me, anytime you have a letter that's asking you to solve, it's saying what possible values for A can you fit in there? So 289, if you don't know two things that multiply together for 289, start trying some. Let's try 15 times 15. Too small. What if it's 20 times 20? Too big. So you know it has to be somewhere between 15 and 20. So let's try 16 times 16. 256. Nope. 17 times 17. 289. So I know that it's 17, but I could also square negative 17. So my answer, plus or minus 17. F. I know it's going to be a plus or minus because I have a variable squared. What number will give me this? I know it has to have a 3 in it, but this answer is 0.09. So let's try 0.3 times 0.3, and it is 0.09. So my answer, plus or minus 0.3. Last one. Has to be plus or minus because it's a variable squared, so all the possibilities for that. Square root of 4, 2. Square root of 25, whoops, is a 5. So I've got plus or minus 2/5. All right. This is the only time that really you're going to have to put the plus or minus in front of it, anytime you see a variable squared. Unless, of course, it has it in the problem to begin with, such as this one. So if it has it in there, your answer is going to be plus or minus. Or if it has a variable squared, it will be a plus or minus. All right, let's move on to the next page. The next page talks about cube roots. So we've already talked about square roots. Now, we did not, however, talk much about perfect squares. So before we move on to that, let's talk about these. Perfect squares. There you go. Perfect squares. Perfect squares are those square roots which you automatically know the answer to. So like if I ask you, what's the square root of 4? How you know that that is 2? Because 4 is a perfect square. All right? 1 is a perfect square. 1 times 1 is 1. 4. 2 times 2 is 4. 9. 3 times 3 is 9. 16. 25. 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, 169. All right, 225. That would be 15 times 15. So we are missing the 14 one here. But we've got 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36. Those are all perfect squares because their square roots come out nice and even. So there is such a thing as also a perfect cube. Obviously not as many because it takes a lot more. So if we've got perfect cubes, 1 is a perfect cube because 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. 8 is a perfect cube. That is 2 times 2 times 2. 27, see they're making much larger leaps here, is 3 times 3 times 3. So all of these right here are perfect cubes. All right, so 8, 2 times 2 times 2. 27, 3 times 3 times 3. 64, 4 times 4 times 4. All right, 125 is a perfect cube because it is 5 times 5 times 5. So with perfect cubes comes a cubed root. So it looks just like a square root sign, except for you will see a little 3 right here. That basically tells you it wants to know what number times itself 3 times will give you 8. And we just discussed that right here. So the cubed root of 8, 2. The cubed root of 125, cubed root of 125. What number times itself 3 times, which is 5. Now again, remember, this does not mean something divided by this. Square roots didn't mean half of that. This does not mean this divided by 3. It means what number times itself 3 times. What number times itself 3 times give you that. All right, so let's talk about this. Cubed root of 125, which we just discussed. Cubed root of a negative. I know whenever we talked about square roots, we said it is not possible to have a square root of a negative because you can't take a number times itself, being both negatives, and end up with a negative number. You can, however, multiply 3 negatives together. If you remember, an even number of negatives will always equal a positive, but an odd number of negatives will always equal a negative. So if I have negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3, 3 times 3 times 3, 27, and I have an odd number of negatives, which makes negative. So the cubed root, negative 3. All right, try these next few on here. Pause it, try it, come back to me. All right, let's look at this. H, the cubed root of H. Sorry, the cubed root of negative, one more time. Cubed root of 729. So I don't know that off the top of my head, so I would pull out a calculator and try some numbers. If we know that, let's say 10 times 10 times 10 would be 1,000. So you know it has to be less than 10. So let's try 9 times 9 times 9. And look at that, it's 729. So you know just by using some estimation skills here and some number sense that we knew we had to go down. So the cubed root of 729 is 9. Cubed root of negative 64. So pretend just for a second that this negative isn't there. Cubed root of 64 is 4. 4 times 4 times 4. And because we know that we need 3 negatives to get that, this has to be a negative. All right, and I just kind of gave this one away just a second ago, I guess. What number times itself 3 times is 1,000? 10. But on this part, I guess the biggest thing I want you to realize, it is possible to take a cubed root of a negative. It is not possible to take a square root of a negative. So kind of keep that in mind as you're going through here. All right. Let's move on to try some guided practice. Let's try some guided practice. So, number 1, find each square root. Find each square root. Let's maybe try some of these together. So I've got a negative. Now, square root of 169 is 13. So because I need to know 2 decimal places, I need to have 2 decimal places in my answer. Not in this, but in 1.3 times 1.3. And again, if you didn't know that or you don't have that number sense about you, take 1.3 times 1.3 in a calculator, you get 1.69. All right, number 2, you've got plus or minus square root of each. So you've got square root of 49 is 7, square root of 144, 12, plus or minus 7/12. I've got the square root of a negative. Hopefully you remember this. You cannot take the square root of a negative, excuse me, so that is a no solution. Again, anytime you have a variable squared, you need to put all possible solutions in here. So I could put 6 in here, or I could also put, it's supposed to be a parenthesis, a negative 6 in here. So my answer, plus or minus 6. This answer, plus or minus 1/3. This answer, plus or minus, and again, if you don't know, let's try something. Let's try 25 times 25. Oh, I am such a good guesser. 25 times 25. But again, it's 6.25. So I need a decimal in there somewhere. 2.5 times 2.5. There we go. 2.5 times 2.5. All right, cubed root of 216. Try something. 5 times 5 times 5. Too small. 6 times 6 times 6. Perfect. Cubed root of 216, 6. Cubed root of 125. We just did 5 times 5 times 5 and got 125, so you know it's going to be a 5. But because you have to have 3 things multiplied together to get a negative, this has got to be a negative number. Same way with this one. 8 is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8, but because it has to multiply to be a negative, your answer has to be a negative.